I wanted to try dehydrating tomatoes because every week at our local farmers market there are flats of tomatoes for sale for a super good price. But I know we wouldn't be able to get through an entire flat of tomatoes before they go bad. So I want to try to dehydrate them and see if it's a reliable way to preserve fresh tomatoes. Now, we don't have a dehydrator, so I'm going to be doing this in the oven. We live in an apartment in a city, and we don't tend to invest in any kitchen appliance that is single purpose because we just don't have the space. I see dehydrators everywhere online. They seem super handy for those of you who have the space, but for this, I'm hoping that our oven will work just fine. So I bought these tomatoes from the store just to try this out because I didn't want to invest in an entire flat of tomatoes before making sure I know what I'm doing. I'm going to begin the process by preheating my oven to 200 degrees Fahrenheit or about 95 degrees Celsius, and lining a baking tray with parchment paper. I'm going to wash these tomatoes and slice them in half. Now I'm going to put them into the oven for about 2 to 3 hours and just keep an eye on the texture. You can dehydrate tomatoes fully, so no liquid left in them, and then you can blend those dehydrated tomatoes into a powder, which is shelf stable. And you can use that powder by adding water. So you can use the powder as like a soup base, or you could add less water and use it as a tomato paste. You can also dehydrate tomatoes nearly all the way, but leave some juice in them. And I think these would be great for on pizzas or in salads or in quiches. You could even chop them up and throw them in sourdough crackers. But basically you can add them to anything where you want the tomatoes to have a bit of chewiness. I've also read that you can fully rehydrate tomatoes in oil or water just by letting them sit in the oil or water for a while and then adding them to whatever recipe calls for fresh tomatoes. I'm not going to be doing that today because my goal is more to see if I can make fresh tomatoes shelf stable by dehydrating them. But I've pulled together information on how to rehydrate tomatoes, and that information is on documentingsimpleliving.com, and I'll put a link to that post in the description. Okay, so this is how they are looking after an hour. They're still very juicy, so I'm going to put them back in the oven for a few more hours, I think. Here they are after 4 hours in the oven in total. So they've been in the oven for 4 hours. They still have juice in them, but I'm going to bed, so I'm going to call it a day here. If you are like me and don't have a dehydrator, I think that I'd recommend budgeting about 6 to 7 hours to fully dehydrate them in the oven. One thing I learned, at least for me, is that I definitely won't be dehydrating tomatoes in this way unless I have a huge amount. Having the oven running for so long and needing to be at home to just manage the oven for multiple hours just really, for me, isn't worth it unless I had a much bigger yield. Of course, this was just an experiment that I was doing to see if I should buy a large amount at our market to dehydrate. And I definitely think that it was worth doing this because I learned that I probably won't buy the flat of tomatoes. I was wanting to fully dehydrate the tomatoes so they were shelf stable, but because of the time that I think it'll take to do that in our oven, I would just rather avoid doing that. I did try raising the temperature to see if it would make the process faster, but they began to burn, so I turned it back down. I would say if you have a large amount of tomatoes and you're willing to spend the time, then this would work for you. I'm just a little impatient. Now, all of that said, these partially dehydrated tomatoes are super delicious. They're so sweet, and they would be great in quiches or on pizzas, salads. And they were actually tasting this great after 2 hours, so it's a lot less time. If your goal is to have more of a sun-dried tomato rather than fully dehydrated, I would definitely give this a try. We have some very over-fermented bread dough that I completely forgot about in the fridge, and what I think I'm going to do is add some of these oven-roasted tomatoes to the dough and try to make crackers. So like a sun-dried sourdough salty cracker. I'm just going to spread some of this very over-fermented dough onto parchment paper and then put on the tomatoes, sprinkle some salt on, and then put them into the oven. There is a full recipe for sourdough discard crackers on documentingsimpleliving.com, and I'll leave a link to that in the description as well. A lot of experiments going on in this video, but my hope is that by sharing what I learn, you will feel confident to also try new things. There's such power in having the skills to know how to preserve food, make bread, and use what we already have. It's also just a more simple way to live. Preserving food means that you don't have to keep going to the shop, Making your own bread means you know exactly what's in it, and using what you already have means that you keep the inventory in your home really minimal. But for now, thank you so much for stopping by today. I make 2 new videos every week sharing what I learn about simplifying food, self-care, and consumption in the modern world. And I will speak to you in the next Documenting Simple Living video.